Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about something that, well, quite frankly, the more I thought about it as I was reading the book, I thought, yes, I guess something like this could occur. We hear about cyberbullying, bullying on the playground, and now we're going to be talking about something known as bullying in the workplace. Joining here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is the author of that book, who is a management advisor and a former senior executive with Canada's two largest retail organizations, and he now heads what is known as the FOS Foundation, which focuses on healthcare, education, and medical research. He has made bullying in the workplace a passion, and helping people to prevent this is a reason for being, according to him. And we're going to discover what that is, what goes on in the workplace, and what we can do about it. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book, The Bully's Trap, Andrew Foss. Andrew, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thanks, Daniel. Pleasure to be on.
Did this start because you were bullied in the workplace, or you just seen a really good friend and you said, you know, enough is enough, I need to do something about this?
Well, it's a combination of, I offer a fairly unique perspective in so much that early in my career I was called out for being a bully. And throughout my career, based on that early intervention, I ensured that organizations that I was responsible for were psychologically safe and bullying was not tolerated. And at the end of my career, I was targeted because I blew the whistle on a corrupt executive, and most horrendous experience I've ever had. And it consumed most of my waking hours, and it was a lot of negative energy that one morning I decided to turn that negative energy into positive energy by helping those who were less fortunate than I was in being able to deal with it in a positive way.
Now, this is something that is really interesting, you know, because people would say, well, bullying in the workplace, you know, maybe listeners out there are going to say, well, you know, I've experienced that, maybe not personally, but secondhand. And I think one of the most interesting things about this, as I was reading in your book, The Bully's Trap, is when you talk about what sort of things really need to occur for this to actually be, you know, considered the bullying. And the one thing you talk about is how a lot of times people in the workplace who are bullies are most of the time just bystanders sort of supporting the bully, which when you kind of look at that is like back in the days when we're on the playground. You got the main guy who's going around making all the rules, even changing the rules of the game to suit his particular needs, and everybody goes along with it because it's better than sitting on the outside looking in, isn't it?
Well, it's more comfortable space, and or I shouldn't say comfortable because it really isn't, but it's more safe space for the bystander to not do what he or she can do to confront the bully.
I see. So now let's talk about those conditions in the workplace that people might come to recognize as, you know, I believe bullying is actually happening here.
Well, it's a combination of things. Most people associate bullying with what they read about bullying in the schoolyard, and bullying in the schoolyard is very overt. Whereas in organizations, it's more subtle and complex, and it's not usually one incident, but it takes place over a period of time. And it includes things like intimidations, threats, harassment, abuse, extortion, and when you use those terms, it resonates with people to say, yeah, you know, I think I'm experiencing that type of thing at work. And most people, when they identify it and they go to somebody to talk to them about it, people say, well, listen, suck it up. That's really the way it is, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And in my book and other work that I do, I challenge that premise that that this is not proper behavior, and the intent of the bully is usually to do harm and to get rid of the person. And unfortunately, people don't realize the extent to which it's happening to them until it's far well into the situation, and the bully has, in essence, turned the target into the villain by harassing them to the point that they do become a poor performer with a bad attitude. And that's why I call the book The Bully's Trap, because so many people fall into that. And it's exactly what the bully wants to happen, giving the bully ammunition to deal with them.
Now, I'm reminded of a time years ago when I happened to have the opportunity to speak with a defense attorney who actually was involved with the Rodney King case, and he put out a book that talked a lot about, I guess in some ways, call it police corruption, and it was really interesting because I wasn't really familiar with this, but it is known as that code blue of silence. In other words, you're part of the police organization, your job is out there to uphold law and order, then you realize people within your organization aren't really carrying this through, that there can be corruption. For instance, planting evidence on somebody who was otherwise innocent. And the next thing you know, well, you need to be quiet about this because we don't rat each other out. And in a situation like that, it can get pretty ugly pretty fast for an individual who really feels committed to doing what it is they're doing when it comes to, for instance, police work.
Yes, and my research would suggest that that is one of the top stress factors in an organization, and we see it still occurring in the military and the police forces, but we're also seeing it in organizations. And the two recent examples are Volkswagen. And they're acknowledging that their toxic culture is and has been a factor in the fact that something as huge as the emissions scandal didn't get exposed before it did. And the reason is that people who were aware of what's going on or what went on were afraid to come forward. So it's not necessarily getting labeled as a snitch here. It's more a fear of being retaliated for going against the grain. The other example is Wells Fargo, who have been charged. They were charged mid-year or in the fall of last year in California for the retail banking unit forcing employees to create dummy accounts to meet quotas. And again, that's an issue of wrongdoing, but the bigger issue is why was it allowed to occur without somebody putting their hand in the air and saying, listen, this is wrong, and it needs to stop. And if it doesn't stop, it needs to get exposed. And there are so many situations like that people are basically afraid to come forward, and it does go beyond the brotherhood factor, if you will, in the police force. It's a real question of outright fear of losing their job if they do come forward.
Well, there's that, and also, as it comes to mind, I was reading in your book, The Bully's Trap, talking about, for instance, the big financial meltdown. You have AIG, Lehman Brothers, and anybody who's actually ever looked into that culture realizes there is a lot of testosterone in that area. In fact, one very fascinating film was The Downfall of Enron, and they showed how that culture came to a point that, for instance, the inmates were taking over the asylum, and you realize, there's a lot going on here that's not good. How do I go about stepping outside of this and make sure that we correct course just short of having to quit? it really can be a very daunting challenge for people, couldn't it?
A very daunting challenge for people, and a very daunting challenge for people who are in charge. And the premise of my book is as Oscar Wilde so aptly put it, it's the prisons that need the reformation, not the prisoners.
Isn't that the truth?
I don't dedicate or spend a lot of energy or time trying to rehabilitate the bullies, because I really question the efficacy of that. It's necessary, but on a one-on-one basis, it won't change the core problem in an organization. And what needs to happen is a cultural change, similar to what the president or then CEO and now chair of GM is doing as a result of the scandal that they had a few years ago. And she recognized that it was a cultural change that was required rather than just putting a Band-Aid on the current issue, which was a huge issue, and it needed more than a Band-Aid. But she recognizes that they had to change the way they fundamentally operated, and the values needed to be at the core of that. And by all indicators, that is working exceptionally well for them. So the first step that I advocate to organizations is really understanding what's going on in your business. And the best way to do that is find out how do your employees feel, and to what extent are employees working to their full potential. And by getting that kind of data, it helps an organization assess, number one, what's really going on in their business, and number two, that there's a huge opportunity for better results in an environment that is psychologically safe, where people can express viewpoints, people don't feel fearful because they could lose their job based on an arbitrary decision. And people do not fear coming forward with an opinion that is not the company line. People are not afraid to put their hand up and say, this is wrong, and we should stop it. And that's where again, bystanders really come into the picture. And the role that they can play as advocates and activists is huge, because they see it every day, and they are able to provide very concrete examples of what is going on and the impact that it's having.
Now, I have to wonder, because of some of the examples that I have brought up as well as yourself, is now you talk about the culture. You know, what is the health of the work culture? And I would have to say, and this is just my opinion, that a lot of times the culture, the health of the culture of a workplace really starts with its leadership, and that could be an area that could eventually brew a condition which could create this bullies trap that we've been talking about. What would you think about that in your experience?
Well, what I'm doing is developing what I call a continuum of bullying, and yes, in most cases it starts at the top. So if you look at a public organization, activist shareholders and other shareholders bully the CEO for short-term results. The CEO bullies their executive team the executive team bullies their managers, and the managers bully the employees, and all of these people become what I refer to as bullied bullies. And most of these people live it day in, day out, and take it home with them. So they become bullies at home. And this impacts the children, who in many cases become bullies in school, and bullies when they enter the workforce. So it is a continuum or a vicious cycle that has and does start at the very, very top. And many organizations look at the issue and assign it to human resources to say, okay, make sure that we don't have a culture where bullying is condoned. And usually what comes out of that is a policy and a few training programs and people going to charm school, but it really doesn't deal with the core issue of why people are behaving the way they're behaving. Mm-hmm. And that usually the boss feels immune to any policy or training program that is put out there, so it becomes very ineffective, I should say, and the culture does not change.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting when we talk about leadership that the possibility, and I believe it's more than a possibility, it's a reality, that the leadership is either going to create a wonderful condition of harmony in the workplace and you get high levels of production and satisfaction by the employees, the subordinates, or you're going to have a mess on your hands. And going back again to the Enron example, just to let some of the listeners know, here was a company that eventually claimed the largest bankruptcy in history. And it was interesting to really look at this because the individual who actually originally wrote the story, the smartest guys in the room, was saying this really isn't about, Wall Street, it isn't about finance, it's actually a story about people. And Enron had some fascinating policies that I think, how did a company ever get that big with these kinds of policies in place? For example, I think it was every quarter they would actually hold a meeting where they brought all the employees together, and the employees would all collectively decide who needed to be let go. Now imagine being in a position like that. And they said that on average yearly that Enron was actually firing 10% of its staff. Now I can't imagine, for instance, any company that could have any kind of growth when you're getting rid of 10% of your staff every year, even being in a situation like that. And then as you were talking about CEOs, they think, well, how does a CEO feel any pressure? Well, now this is Enron, which became a publicly traded company. And in your book, you state that 73% of the CEOs indicated that they could argue they were being bullied by their board of directors because of the pressure for short-term results. So you can see how even the culture of people who are indirectly involved with the company, such as investors, stockholders, and the like, are those kinds of people that unwittingly are involved in something that perpetuates into this because they're looking, of course, for their money to grow. So it's really an interesting thing that you think, where do we put our finger on it? Where do we really start to change that culture? Obviously the first thing is awareness, then education, and then proper implementation, but it really seems to be a very difficult path to work.
Well, it is, and another great example is what Pope Francis is going through.
Oh boy, don't you know that one? That was a great example, by the way, using the book. I would have never thought about it, but goodness gracious, we're talking about the Catholics and a guy that really is a Jesuit, so to speak. But anyway,
yes,
go ahead.
And I hope he survives long enough to truly influence a change there. But it does show the even at the top the resistance that leaders will get. So in Pope Francis's case, it's the cardinals and the bishops who thrive under the kind of hierarchy that has existed for centuries. And appear oblivious to the real challenge, and that is regaining the moral authority to dispense advice and espouse beliefs, and that is the objective of Pope Francis, and he makes no bones about it to say, the barriers are the way that we conduct ourselves, and that has to change. And the resistance that he is facing is huge. And thankfully, he's got the energy and the vision, and from what I can gather, the Jesuit tenacity to carry it off.
Here's another interesting example as well. Not too long ago, I was talking with a friend of mine about an interesting movie that's out there called Anonymous. For many years, apparently, I didn't know this until seeing this, there has been a long-running scholarly debate about whether or not Shakespeare was the person who actually wrote the Shakespeare plays. So that's what this was about. It was to clue in, well, this would be ideal of who actually would have done this, the kind of person it would have been. And it was funny in talking with him because slowly he became a little bit outraged about what I was suggesting. And I wasn't saying Shakespeare didn't write anything. How would I know? I'm just saying this movie suggests, and these are from scholars that have long contended, that possibility is pretty strong that he in fact didn't do this. But he was also somebody who was studying Shakespeare in such a way that he actually wanted to teach and actually write a book on it. And you realize that in our education system, this is huge when it comes to bullying, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's funny to think about it that way because on the playground, I would think it exists because that culture existed from the top down. And the kids are just acting out something I would almost guess, inherently know is there. I'm not saying it's the total result, but it's a possibility that's a contribution anyway.
Yes. And in the schools, you have the added dynamic of 80% of students in high schools. Now, this is according to a Yale study that was conducted last year, responded to the question, how do you feel about school? And 80% gave a negative response. And the three top answers to an open-ended question of how do you feel about school: tired, bored, and stressed. And 70% of the 80% negative responses came out with being stressed 80% of the time they're at school.
It just seems so daunting that anybody even has to face things like this. Now, you really work at helping people to help to at least change their involvement in it, whether it's directly they're ones doing it or the ones who are involved. How do you get started in such a way that this can actually turn into a positive outcome?
Well, in terms of what I do is the first step was writing the book. And the purpose of the book was and is to open a discussion and debate on what has been a silent epidemic for eons. And as I indicated earlier, we read a lot about school bullying, and it's largely due to the suicides that have happened over the past few years. What is not recognized and has not been discussed is that suicides are a huge factor in school bullying as well. So my intent and objective is to get a discussion and debate going getting a discussion and debate on what I believe to be one of society's and biggest issue. It's both it's a social and economic issue. And I don't have all of the answers, but by getting more and more people to debate it and talk about it, we will come up with better solutions than nothing happening at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that's certainly true is when you can understand, what constitutes bullying, what are the signs. There are real obvious ones. For instance, the boss that may come out to you and decide that you need a little chewing out because of a mistake you made, but you realize, I'm really experiencing a lot more than you being upset about the mistake that I made that involves the company. Did your wife throw you out of the house last night? Or another example is, and you see this all the time in places like retail and restaurants, the customer walks in, they've got the money to spend, so they're entitled to be any way they decide they want to be, or they're going to complain to somebody. In restaurants, it's just terrible what these people sometimes have to put up with. But, it's in recognizing that, as you're talking, and then, trying to get the conversation going, that is a really good start. And what are some ways that you could suggest our listeners, besides the Bully's Trap, which I got to say, it's an interesting read because, quite frankly, it pisses you off because you realize how much of this is actually around you. I think at first people are going to scratch their heads saying, no, but the more you look into this, and from what I've seen over the years, yes, it really does exist, and it's all around you. In fact, you may be somebody who's being pushed around now, and it's pretty interesting that way. But give us an idea of some of the other things that you have attempted to help people come to be able to help to, again, change the culture to make it a more positive one.
Well, what I have worked on individually with organizations is a step-by-step process. And the first step, as I indicated, is to really understand what is going on in your organization. And I get a lot of pushback by executives saying, well, that what you're describing is extreme, and they're extreme exaggerations, and it's not happening in my arena. We've got EAP programs, we've got engagement surveys that are over the top, we have 360 feedback, we have a whistleblower hotline, we've got enlightened human resource people. I have to interject on that one by saying, and you're not enlightened? So they go on and on with what they have, and my reaction to that is geez, that's great. What are you doing?
Right.
And then if I'm aware of other organizational statistics, i.e. the financials, customer feedback, attrition rates, turnover rates, in unionized environments, grievances. So there's a number of things you can look at and say, okay, if you've got all of these great scores relative to your employees, why is your customer index as low as it is?
Mm-hmm.
Because one would think that a high employee score would equal high customer score. Also, why is your turnover and attrition rate at the level it is? And when you correlate the data with another set of eyes looking at it, it identifies where there are problems. The other is I advocate and conduct surveys on how people feel. And there's 4 questions I ask. How do you feel about your work? Why do you feel the way you do? To what extent are you working at your full potential? What are the barriers to your working to your full potential? And then there's a supplementary question for people in supervisory or management positions, and I ask, how do your employees feel? And how do you want your employees to feel? And when you correlate that together, and again with the other data that the organization has, it yields some very, very interesting things. And what I look for are what I refer to as unnecessary stress factors. So it enables an organization to say, yeah, I understand that. And why do people feel stressed over that? And that's a very easy fix. And usually they are. But it does require a total shift in attitude. Managers who rule by fear versus respect will fight that tooth and nail, and that's the biggest obstacle. And knowing that that's the biggest obstacle, it's also the group that you really have to focus on. You tell them, okay, here's how you guys responded to how you feel. Quite frankly, it's not a lot different than how your employees feel. So should we change and eliminate the stress factor for you, but not them? And usually that gets them engaged and endorse the kind of changes that are necessary. Quite a few organizations don't even want to talk about it.
Well, it's the whole idea, I'm the management, those are the subordinates out there, I'm right, and well, they basically just have to do what I say because that's what they pay me to do. And that's why I mentioned earlier in the program, I really believe this really starts, a huge majority of it starts from the top and it rolls down. Where else is it going to go?
It's got to start at the top. Mm-hmm. But the bystanders can play a role as activist shareholders are playing a role in pushing for changes and results. Bystanders can similarly become activists relative to forcing change on an organization. Mm-hmm. But it has to be endorsed and led by the top. Mm-hmm. There's no question.
I know, just for the quick story, if I may, Andrew, back when I had served in the United States military in the Navy, as I'm in basic training, there's a period of time that you go through called Service Week. So you get pulled out of your company and you go to wherever they decide you're going to go to, and of course, I got the galley duty. Imagine you're serving thousands of new recruits, 3 meals a day in a place, that's that big. Well, anyway, my company commander, he decided perhaps I needed an attitude adjustment, so he put me in the worst place you could be, which was the deep sink. And our responsibility was to scrub all the big stainless steel baking pans and sheet pans. And you'd be astounded how many stacks of these things came at this area each and every day, and it was a 16-hour day, easy, 3:30 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. And it was funny because when I got there, I'll never forget the speech of the guy that ran the deep sink, and they were ran by recruits. You could eventually find yourself becoming what would be called the deep sea captain, I guess. But he, if you do this, you're going to go to IT, which is intensive training, and if you do this, and you could see in his eyes, he just wanted you to screw up, because he had that power to just make your life miserable, right? So I kept my mouth shut, put my head down, and did exactly what I was supposed to do. Eventually, over time, I had gained, the respect of the guy who was the assistant deep sink captain, so he decided by the 3rd day that I was there to promote me up to his position, which meant that I would automatically become the captain. Now, what's interesting is these pans came in from both sides, and when I first started there was an average of anywhere from 8 to 13 stacks as tall as I was, and I was about 6'1", and that was on both sides of the kitchen. Okay, and I just imagine how much work that is. When I finally took over with the same amount of men, we were actually taking breaks and sitting out and smoking cigarettes because we had nothing to do. Now, what changed there was the fact that I respected my crew, that we were all in this together, and they respected me back because they seen that I was willing to work as hard as they were. Even though I was in charge, you don't have to do this, you can sit down. I enjoy doing that. Why don't you go out and have a cigarette break or something like that? I mean, that's what it became, and that inspired me to realize, leadership is an inspired thing, and when you write something like The Bully's Trap, that's where I grit my teeth because you're so right on about a lot of things. And this seems like something that I wished you would collaborate with, for instance, best-selling author Ken Blanchard, the 1 Minute Manager.
Yes.
Bring these two things together and, oh my goodness, and just write one hell of a book that might actually help, managers scratch their head and say, maybe I was wrong because, look, this culture, I don't even want to come to work. Much less the people that I'm in charge of, and to change that so everybody enjoys what they're doing for the most part.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I have recently partnered with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and with a view of working on a major initiative to do just that. And added to that is to give organizations a bit of a hook, in so much that placing a real value on creating psychologically safe workplaces, or changing from a toxic culture to a positive culture. And that's been the issue for decades, where leadership has not really been convinced that there is a significant gain or opportunity relative top and bottom line growth. And academics have been trying to break the code for years. And my reaction to that, well, it's not an academic or theoretical exercise.
I couldn't agree with you more.
It's a very real issue. But combining an academic review and overview along with a business perspective and business people coming from the private and public sector to break that code, I believe will go a long way in terms of convincing leaders that this is not something that is optional here. The way we're operating is a lost opportunity, and we've got to think a little bit longer term, and it's not that long, where our number one issue is going to be attracting and retaining the right people. Mm-hmm. And that's some sectors are already seeing that, and that's not a question of just throwing more money at it, because people are looking and will be looking for an environment that they can find and will find fulfilling, and organizations that will respect them and treat them fairly.
Mm-hmm. Here, definitely. So this, I'm guessing, is going to create a new book in your near future. Am I correct about that?
Well, we're hoping so, and I don't consider myself an author. When I was asked,
you wrote a book. You're an author. You're on our program. You're an author. And believe me, if you produce something going in that direction, I'm for it. Just to let you know, I think it was about 2 months ago, I did an interview on a book called The Silo Effect. And those are conditions that can create bullying cultures, definitely,
yes.
Because, and it was really fascinating how, this has to change because we're dealing with an upcoming generation that could care less whether they're in the workplace enjoying themselves or not. They want to feel a sense of contribution. Their work has to have meaning, and that's what they're looking for. It isn't just a place anymore where people are trying to pay their bills and maybe afford enough, to go on vacations, buy a home, but it has to have purpose. And if you're going into an environment that makes you feel other than that, they'll just walk away. It isn't like it used to be where you were sort of stuck as back in the old slavery days in the cotton field and there's nowhere for you to go, or I can blacklist you, whatever the case is. It's not that way anymore, and if these people don't start pulling their heads out and realizing, look, that old way just will never be effective. ever again, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Well, I tell this story often, and it's against a survey that Gallup has been doing for eons. I think it's around 20 years. And it talks about the level of engagement of employees. And Canada and the U.S. right now sit at roughly 70% of employees who are not engaged. That means there are only 30% of employees who are engaged. And I often get the question, well, what do you mean by engagement? Just to have them being happy? And I said, no, it's much more than that. People are not engaged for a variety of reasons. And usually the reason is the unnecessary stress they have to deal with. But if you want an interpretation of engagement, refer to President Kennedy when he visited Cape Canaveral, as it was called then. And he went around asking people, well, what do you do? And so most of the people there were engineers, and they looked at this piece of machinery and said, well, I calibrated this, and I did this, and then another person said, I did this in very technical terms, and then he ran into a janitor, and he said, well, what do you do? And the janitor said, well, Mr. President, I'm helping to send a man to the moon and return him back safely.
How about that?
And that is engagement.
And that's also the kind of culture you need. Everybody feels their role is just as important as everyone else's. And that was what was interesting about the silo effect, is it showed how people working inside of isolated boxes and keeping away from other people, that sort of thing, then you get these inner warfares, and it's like, but look, we're in the same company. We're in this together. What are you doing? And there are times you need that, when you need that isolated focus. But for the most part, it's coming back and realizing, for instance, like Facebook is one of those examples, I guess, because they talked about social media and how they do that a lot more effectively. And it's just really interesting that, even 30 years ago I was thinking, this old school way of managing in that kind of work environment, it just doesn't work. Nobody's loyal anymore. And then there should have been the first sign is the lack of company loyalty. People aren't spending 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the same company because they just don't feel that the company cares anymore. And then the company scratches, well, I'm paying them. Well, yeah, but people don't go to work just for that. There's more to it than that.
Well, it's interesting. Those very, very early in my research. But what I'm finding is with the millennials, if you ask them what their desire is there's a big desire for being affiliated with an organization, provided they remain fulfilled with a sense of purpose and are able to work to their full potential and have mobility, and not necessarily upward mobility, but changes to keep their mind occupied and fulfilled. So the notion of wanting to change organizations is again this is still very, very preliminary, but it's based on what's happened in the last 10 years, or maybe even 15 years, where people have moved along, but they left because of the negatives, and they would have stayed if there were more positives, and the positives for them would be the things like fulfillment and mobility, and again, not necessarily upward mobility.
I think that's one of the big illusions, is that a lot of times, especially when it comes to leadership, they feel that, well, how many more raises can I give somebody? And I'm saying, no, there's a lot more to it than that. In fact, there's such subtle things you do that a raise becomes one of the last things that would actually make people happy. And people are surprised when I say that. But if you're paying attention, it's just really amazing how all this works when it comes to just respecting other people, that they've taken the time away from their families. It's their time, and they're giving it to this company or this organization because they believe in what they're doing, and you're removing that belief from them. That's really what it is. What do you think about something like that?
Well, totally agree, and that's it's a whole shift in attitude on what people claim to be a valuable resource, and it boggles my mind to when I hear examples of organizations that are proud of the churn in terms of letting 10% of their workforce go. And a great example of that is Amazon. I don't know whether you read the expose in the New York Times. This goes back a couple of months ago.
Now, if I remember, that was the one where it was dealing with older employees and the fact that they couldn't keep up. Is that the one you're talking about?
No.
Okay.
It actually, the thing is, they don't have older employees.
Right. Well, because I remember the producer was talking to me about something like that, and I said, well, you're talking about warehouse work, and if a person gets older, they really should develop themselves to a point they don't have to do that physical labor, because really, if you can't keep up in a situation like a UPS or Federal Express, hey, sorry, it really is about just keeping up, because they got schedules to keep. So, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and there are a lot of systemic programs out there that it's not because of their physical ability so much as organizations view people over 45 with 10 years service as a liability, particularly those organizations that have defined benefits on retirement, and certainly do the job physically, but they become too expensive, and that's more of the issue. If you look at the auto industry, it's a great example of an organization that has shifted from the manual work to assembly workers becoming technicians. And the ratio of technicians to somebody who has to handle a heavy piece of equipment is totally reversed. Like it's an 80-20, where 20 years ago was 20% heavy lifting, and 80% heavy lifting and 20% technician. So the answer to it is shifting an attitude to say, well, these people, you've invested in them in terms of hiring them, and if, regardless of age, if that person leaves, what kind of investment do you have to make to bring somebody new in to replace them with? And in the service industry, we'll say, well, we really don't need, a high degree of skilled labor to do the work that we can get at minimum wage. And my challenge to them is, okay, if you get these workers at minimum wage, how engaged are they with your customers? And if they don't have an affiliation or a loyalty to the organization, that is going to reflect on customer service. Mm-hmm. Getting people to make the connection between output, in the case of the service industry, is how the customer feels, and will the customer come back will a customer buy more when they're there because of the way they're treated, then again, it becomes a lost opportunity for organizations who don't view it that way.
I think, too, that you raise a very interesting point, Andrew, about minimum wage workers. You know, why should I bother trying to retain this person here, you know, at this rate when I can go and get somebody who can do the same job for minimum wage? Well, anybody who's certainly worked at minimum wage, which I know I'm one of those, realizes your eyes are always on the horizon for more money. How long do you think a person like that's going to stick around or even care about what they're doing? All they're looking for is a payday, most of the time. Very rarely is it somebody really trying to start on the ground floor with an opportunity to do better than what they're doing.
And absolutely, but they also, in many cases, they're part-time employees who either do it to supplement their retirement, or students who are going on to do other things. And understanding how those people feel about what they're doing, why they feel the way they do, is so critical. So, for example, a retiree, yes, may be doing it because it supplements the retirement income, but it also, in many cases, enables them to feel that they are still valuable and have the opportunity to interact with others.
You certainly can't sit around and play golf all day.
Well, and so many, you know, and there's so many people in that situation, and the minimum wage is not necessarily the driving force. It's a different reason. For students or for people unable to enter or having difficulty entering the workforce, and you hear from them, this is an opportunity for me to build a reputation as an employee. And if I do a good job here, yes, I know it's at minimum wage, but if I could do a good job here, the likelihood of my finding something else, either internal within this organization or outside the organization, that will allow me to make that jump from the minimum wage to something that pays better and maybe more fulfilling, likely be more fulfilling. So if you understand that from the individual, you can better accommodate them with things other than just raising the rate to keep them.
You know, I agree so much with what you're saying there. In fact, I remember best-selling author Robert Kiyosaki of the Rich Dad, Poor Dad books. And he says, you know, the only reason, at least for the most part, that you should work a job is so somebody pays you for the skills that you would like to have. But then I say on top of that, and just with what you're saying is this, why not build those skills and say to a company, I believe I can provide more value to you now. It doesn't have to be in money, but I wouldn't mind more responsibility. Then we can talk about how that bottom line may be increasing to such a degree that I might be able to see my bottom line, you know, increase. But the whole idea from the individual perspective, as you're saying, is to gain as much skill as they will allow you to gain. If they don't want to increase your responsibility, they don't want to increase your pay, then you take the skills and you move on somewhere else, but you take them with you.
Exactly. It's not a waste.
Not at all. The book is Bullying in the Workplace. Our guest today, Andrew Foss. Is there a website, Andrew, people can go and find out more about this?
Yes, it's www.andrewfoss.com, and it's spelled F-A-A-S.
Like I said, this is one of those books that I think everybody should read, even the newbies who haven't even been in the workplace, because I think, as you were saying, you get the conversation, especially the awareness going, you can kind of learn perhaps ways that this could be solved, and it does start, I say, from the leadership down, but it also starts from the individual as well, and it's really an interesting conversation we should all be having.
Hey, thank you very much.
And it's been a pleasure to have you here on the Beyond 50 radio program. I don't even feel bullied anymore.
Oh, good.
Andrew, thanks again.
Bye-bye.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. If you feel bullied in the workplace or you see it happening, hey, step up to bat and see what you can do or what can be done about that to make the place a more harmonious place for you as well as the individuals to work in. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. And we encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.